September 12, 1943. The war had taken an unexpected turn that would change everything for a group of young Italian women who never imagined they would become prisoners of their former allies. When Italy announced its armistice with the Allies on September 8th, the world watched as the country that had once stood alongside Germany suddenly switched sides. But this dramatic shift left thousands of Italians in a dangerous limbo, caught between nations and allegiances. Among them were members of the Italian Women's Auxiliary Corps, young women who had served in administrative and support roles for the Italian military. Now, as their country descended into chaos with German forces occupying the north and Allied troops pushing up from the south, these women found themselves classified as enemy prisoners of war, transported across the Atlantic to a fate they could never have predicted. The transport truck rumbled through the Pennsylvania countryside, carrying 47 Italian women toward a small prisoner of war facility outside the town of Harrisburg. These were not the hardened soldiers that typically filled POW camps across America. They were clerks, radio operators, nurses, and translators, ranging in age from 19 to 36. They wore the remnants of their gray-green auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the insignia of units that no longer existed in any meaningful way. Their faces reflected a complex mixture of relief at having survived, shame at their country's surrender, and profound uncertainty about what awaited them in this foreign land. 24-year-old Lucia Martinelli sat near the back of the truck, her dark eyes fixed on the unfamiliar landscape rolling past. She had grown up in a small village outside Naples, where her family had operated a modest trattoria for 3 generations. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps in 1941, believing she was serving her country's honor and defense. Now that country had collapsed around her, leaving her stranded on the wrong side of the ocean, classified as an enemy of people she had never personally wronged. Beside her sat Elena Russo, a radio operator from Milan, and Giovanna Costa, a nurse from Sicily. The 3 had formed a quiet bond during their weeks of transport and processing, united by their shared confusion about their status and their future. As the truck passed through the gates of the camp, the women caught their first glimpse of their new home. It was smaller than they had expected, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. American soldiers watched their arrival with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Unlike the male POW camps that held thousands of German and Italian soldiers, this facility had been hastily converted to house female prisoners, a relatively rare occurrence that left both captors and captives uncertain about proper protocols and expectations. Captain James Morrison, the officer assigned to oversee the facility, stood waiting as the women filed off the truck. He had received minimal guidance from his superiors about how to handle Italian women prisoners, especially given Italy's ambiguous new status as a co-belligerent rather than a traditional enemy. He watched as the women formed orderly lines, maintaining military bearing even in their defeat and displacement. The first weeks at the Pennsylvania camp established patterns that would define the early days of captivity. The Italian women moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, their faces carefully composed masks that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. They woke at dawn, attended roll call, performed assigned duties, ate meals in silence, and retired to their barracks without engaging more than absolutely necessary with their American captors. This wasn't open rebellion or hostility, but rather a quiet preservation of dignity in circumstances that had stripped away nearly everything else they had once possessed. Lucia found herself assigned to laundry duties alongside 8 other women. They spent their days washing uniforms, bedding, and towels in large industrial machines, the hot steam and chemical smell of soap filling the work building. The women spoke to each other only in hushed Italian, careful to maintain distance from the American soldiers who supervised their work. Private Robert Chen, a young guard whose parents had immigrated from China, watched them with patient curiosity, but his attempts at friendly conversation were met with polite nods and nothing more. Elena worked in the administrative office, filing paperwork and organizing records under the supervision of Sergeant Mary Phillips, one of only 3 female American soldiers at the facility. Elena's fluent English made her valuable for translation work, but she used her language skills sparingly, offering only the minimum words required to complete her tasks. She had learned during processing that speaking too freely could be misinterpreted as collaboration or disloyalty to Italy, even though Italy itself had already surrendered. Giovanna assisted in the camp infirmary, where her nursing training made her indispensable to Dr. Thomas Walsh. Of all the women, she found it hardest to maintain emotional distance. Medicine required communication, empathy, and trust. When she treated a young American soldier for a sprained ankle, she had to fight against her natural instinct to offer comfort alongside care. The soldier thanked her in broken Italian he had learned from his grandparents, and Giovanna felt tears threatening before she turned away. The women ate their meals together in a separate section of the mess hall, American food that seemed bland and strange compared to what they had known. Everything was overcooked, underseasoned, and served in portions that seemed simultaneously too large and unsatisfying. They picked at meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans that had been boiled until they lost all color and flavor. Some of the women had lost dangerous amounts of weight during their capture and transport, but the unfamiliar food made it difficult to regain their strength. In the barracks at night, the women's carefully maintained composure would sometimes crack. Quiet crying could be heard from different bunks, quickly stifled so as not to disturb others or show weakness. Lucia would lie awake, thinking about her family's restaurant, wondering if it still stood or if Allied bombs had reduced it to rubble. She thought about her mother's hands shaping pasta, her father's voice calling orders during the dinner rush, her younger brother's laughter. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Thursday, October 7th, 1943, began like any other morning at the camp. The women rose before dawn, went through roll call, and dispersed to their various work assignments. The autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the first hints of the Pennsylvania winter that would soon arrive. Lucia walked toward the laundry building alongside Elena and Giovanna, their breath visible in the cool morning air, their conversation limited to practical observations about the weather and their tasks ahead. But something was different that morning. As they passed near the main mess hall, a scent drifted across the compound that made all 3 women stop in their tracks. It was subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the usual cooking smells that emanated from the kitchen. But as they stood frozen on the pathway, the aroma grew stronger and more distinct. Tomatoes, garlic, basil, oregano. The unmistakable fragrance of a sauce that every Italian knew in their bones, passed down through generations like a genetic memory. Lucia felt her chest tighten. The scent transported her instantly across the ocean and back through time. She was standing in her family's kitchen again, watching her grandmother stir a pot of sugo while humming old Neapolitan songs. She could see the worn wooden spoon, the splattered apron, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. The memory was so vivid that for a moment she forgot where she was, forgot that she was a prisoner thousands of miles from that beloved kitchen. Elena gripped Lucia's arm, her own eyes wide with recognition and longing. Around them, other Italian women had also stopped, their faces reflecting the same shocked recognition. The practical, purposeful movement of prisoners heading to work assignments had ground to a halt as women stood scattered across the compound, all of them arrested by the same powerful scent that spoke of home, family, and a life that seemed impossibly distant. Giovanna was the first to move, drawn toward the mess hall as if pulled by invisible strings. Others followed, including Lucia and Elena, until nearly 24 Italian women had gathered near the kitchen building, their morning assignments forgotten. They stood in a loose cluster, not speaking, just breathing in the aroma that grew richer and more complex with each passing moment. American guards watched this strange gathering with confusion, uncertain whether this constituted some form of protest or rebellion. Through the kitchen window, movement could be seen. Someone was cooking, and whatever they were preparing had the power to break through months of carefully maintained emotional control. The women waited, though for what? None of them could have said. They simply stood there, unable to walk away from this unexpected connection to everything they had lost. The scent wrapped around them like an embrace, cruel in its kindness, offering comfort while simultaneously highlighting the vast distance between where they were and where they longed to be. Captain Morrison emerged from his office, ready to disperse what he assumed was an unauthorized gathering, but something in the women's faces made him pause. The kitchen door swung open, and Sergeant Frank Caruso emerged carrying a large pot, completely unprepared for the sight that greeted him. Nearly 30 Italian women prisoners stood in an irregular semicircle outside the mess hall, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him stop mid-step. He was a stocky man in his early 40s, with the weathered hands of someone who had spent years working with food. His own eyes, dark and expressive, reflected immediate understanding of what was happening. Lucia stood at the front of the group, close enough to see the steam rising from the pot, close enough to identify without any doubt what it contained: spaghetti, meatballs. The sauce clinging to the pasta was deep red, glistening with olive oil, flecked with herbs. It looked exactly like what her grandmother had made every Sunday, what her mother had prepared for every celebration, what she had learned to cook herself before the war had pulled her away from that life. Something inside her shattered. All the careful control she had maintained since her capture, all the dignity she had clung to during the humiliating process of becoming a prisoner, all the strength she had summoned to endure each day in this foreign place, it all crumbled in the face of this simple dish that represented everything she had lost. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and then a sound escaped her throat, half sob, half moan, a raw expression of grief that she had been suppressing for months. The dam had broken. Around her, other women began to cry as well. Elena covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Giovanna sank to her knees on the dusty ground, weeping openly. Some women stood frozen with tears streaming silently down their faces. Others embraced each other, holding tight, as if they might anchor one another against the flood of emotion that the simple smell of home cooking had unleashed. Sergeant Caruso set down the pot carefully, his own eyes glistening. He understood exactly what was happening because he had experienced his own version of this longing. His grandparents had come from Calabria, bringing their recipes and traditions with them. He had grown up eating his nonna's cooking, learning her techniques, absorbing the food culture that defined his family's identity. When he had been assigned to cook for this POW camp, he had decided this morning to make something that would remind him of home. He had never imagined it would have this effect. Captain Morrison approached the group slowly, uncertain how to handle this situation. This wasn't defiance or rebellion. This was grief, raw and undisguised. These women weren't crying because they were prisoners. They were crying because someone had accidentally reminded them of everything they had been before they became prisoners. They were crying for lost homes, scattered families, and a country that had betrayed them. They were crying because food, that most basic human need, had the power to carry memory and meaning across oceans. Sergeant Frank Caruso stood before the weeping women, fully aware that he had inadvertently created a crisis that his commanding officer would need to resolve. But instead of retreating to the safety of the kitchen, he did something unexpected. He began to speak in Italian. His accent was thick with American influence, the grammar imperfect, but the words were unmistakably those of southern Italy, the dialect of his grandmother's village. "Mi dispiace," he said softly. "I'm sorry. Non volevo farvi piangere. I didn't mean to make you cry." The women's heads lifted, surprise momentarily cutting through their grief. An American soldier speaking Italian was unexpected enough, but hearing the particular rhythms and pronunciations of home dialects was something else entirely. Lucia wiped her eyes, studying this man who had just shattered her composure with tomato sauce and pasta. Sergeant Caruso continued speaking, his Italian flowing more easily now. He explained that his grandmother, Nonna Maria, had come from a small village outside Cosenza in 1907. She had brought nothing with her except a few photographs, her wedding dress, and the recipes that lived in her memory. In America, she had recreated the flavors of home in her kitchen, teaching her grandson that food was more than sustenance. It was identity, history, and love transformed into something you could taste. Every Sunday, he said, switching back to English so Captain Morrison could understand, my nonna made sugo. She started before dawn, cooking the sauce for hours until it was perfect. She made meatballs the size of walnuts, not too big, not too small. She said that anyone who didn't know how to make proper sugo didn't know who they were. Several of the women nodded, recognizing this truth that transcended language and nationality. Lucia found her voice, speaking in careful English. My grandmother said the same thing. She said the sauce must cook slowly, with patience, like raising children. If you rush it, everyone will taste your hurry and know you don't care enough. Her words came out thick with emotion, but clear enough. Around her, other women murmured agreement in Italian, their grief beginning to transform into something different, something closer to recognition and connection. Sergeant Caruso smiled, a genuine expression that softened his military bearing. My nonna said you can tell everything about a woman by her sugo. Is she patient? Is she generous? Does she understand that the best things in life require time and attention? He gestured toward the pot he had set down. This batch, I started it at 4 this morning. I used canned tomatoes because that's what we have, but I added fresh garlic, fresh basil from the garden behind the mess hall, oregano, a little sugar to cut the acid. I made the meatballs by hand, mixing beef with pork, bread soaked in milk, eggs, Parmesan cheese, parsley. Elena spoke up, her voice steadier than Lucia's had been. Your nonna taught you well. We could smell every ingredient from across the compound. It smells exactly like home. Captain Morrison watched this exchange with growing amazement, realizing that food had accomplished what weeks of attempts at communication had failed to achieve. Captain Morrison made a decision that would alter the entire dynamic of the camp. Instead of dispersing the women back to their work assignments, he invited them into the mess hall. Sergeant Caruso served each woman a plate of spaghetti and meatballs, the same portions he had prepared for the American soldiers. The Italian women sat at the long tables, staring at their plates with expressions that mixed longing, gratitude, and lingering sorrow. Lucia lifted her fork, wound the spaghetti around it the way she had been taught as a child, and took her first bite. The taste was almost exactly right. The sauce had the proper balance of sweetness and acidity. The herbs were fresh and fragrant. The meatballs were tender and well-seasoned. It wasn't identical to her grandmother's recipe because no two cooks made sauce exactly the same way, but it was close enough to unlock another wave of memories. This time, though, the memories didn't bring tears. They brought something closer to comfort. Around her, other women were having similar experiences. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite, as if they could make the plate last forever. Others ate quickly, almost desperately, as if the food might disappear if they didn't claim it immediately. Conversations began to flow in Italian, women comparing this sauce to their own family recipes, debating the proper ratio of beef to pork in meatballs, discussing regional variations in pasta dishes. Sergeant Caruso moved among the tables, listening to their conversations. His Italian wasn't fluent enough to catch everything, but he understood enough to recognize that they were talking about food with the passion and precision that only Italians could bring to the subject. When he paused near Lucia's table, she looked up at him and spoke in English. Your grandmother would be proud. This is very good. Not exactly like my nonna's, but very, very good. He pulled up a chair, sitting down among the prisoners in a way that would have been unthinkable just an hour earlier. "Tell me about your Nona's recipe. What did she do differently?" And so began a conversation that bridged the gap between captor and captive, between American and Italian, between present circumstances and cherished past. Lucia described how her grandmother always added a small amount of pancetta to the sauce for depth of flavor, how she insisted on using San Marzano tomatoes, how she believed that stirring the sauce clockwise brought good luck. Elena joined in, explaining that in Milan they made their meatballs smaller and lighter, mixing in more bread and less meat because of northern sensibilities about economy and refinement. Giovanna countered that in Sicily they added raisins and pine nuts to their meatballs, creating a sweet-savory combination that the northerners found strange but that she missed desperately. The conversation expanded to include other women, each sharing their regional variations, their family secrets, their opinions about the proper way to prepare different dishes. Captain Morrison watched from across the room as his prisoners and his cook engaged in animated discussion about food, their hands gesturing expressively, their faces alive with passion and memory. He realized he was witnessing something remarkable. Food had become a language that transcended the barriers of war, nationality, and imprisonment. 3 weeks after the spaghetti incident, as it came to be known in the camp, the first batch of Red Cross letters arrived for the Italian prisoners. The women gathered in the main hall as Captain Morrison distributed the thin envelopes, each one representing months of searching through displaced persons records, refugee camps, and lists of survivors. Of the 47 women in the camp, only 19 received letters. The silence that followed was heavy with dread and hope intermingled. Lucia held her envelope with trembling hands, afraid to open it, but more afraid not to. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, not her mother's careful script or her father's bold strokes. She tore it open carefully, unfolding the single page inside. The words were in Italian, written by someone who identified herself as Signora Benedetti, a neighbor from her village. Lucia's eyes scanned the page, her breath catching as she absorbed the information. Her village had been bombed during an Allied air raid in July, targeting German positions that had occupied the area after Italy's surrender. Her family's restaurant was gone, reduced to rubble. Her father had been killed in the bombing. Her mother and younger brother had survived and were living in a refugee center in Naples, but they had no home to return to, no business to rebuild, nothing left of their former life. The letter ended with Signora Benedetti's assurance that they were safe and that they sent their love, but Lucia could read between the lines the devastation that safety couldn't repair. Around the hall, other women were reading their own letters, each containing its own version of tragedy. Elena learned that her family's apartment building in Milan had been destroyed during German reprisals against Italian resistance fighters. Her parents were alive but had fled to the countryside, staying with distant relatives in a farmhouse already crowded with other displaced families. Her 2 brothers, who had been soldiers in the Italian army, were missing, their fate unknown. Giovanna's letter brought the worst news. Her entire family had been in Palermo when Allied forces bombed the port facilities. None of them had survived. The letter, written by a Red Cross worker, was clinical in its details, offering only facts without comfort. Giovanna read it twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope, her face pale but composed. She stood up and walked out of the hall without speaking to anyone. Lucia found her later behind the barracks, sitting on the ground with her back against the wall, staring at nothing. Lucia sat down beside her, not speaking, just present. After a long silence, Giovanna finally spoke in Italian, her voice flat and distant. "I have nothing to go back to. No family, no home, no reason to return. I am Italian, but Italy doesn't exist for me anymore." Lucia reached over and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. She didn't offer empty comfort or false hope. She simply sat with her friend in shared grief. The letters from Italy forced the women to confront a reality they had been avoiding since their capture. Italy's surrender on September 8th had not brought peace to their homeland. Instead, it had plunged the country into chaos and civil war. German forces, viewing Italy's armistice with the Allies as betrayal, had occupied the northern and central regions, treating their former allies as enemies. The Italian Social Republic, a puppet state controlled by remaining fascists, claimed legitimacy in the north, while the legitimate Italian government operated from the south under Allied protection. For the women in the Pennsylvania camp, this meant they existed in a legal and moral limbo that defied easy categorization. Were they still enemies of America? Were they allies now that Italy had switched sides? Were they traitors to Italy for having been captured by Americans? The questions had no clear answers, and the uncertainty ate at them daily. Unlike German or Japanese prisoners who at least had the clarity of knowing where they stood, the Italian women occupied an ambiguous space that offered neither the rights of allies nor the clear status of enemies. Elena struggled particularly with this confusion. During mail call, she had watched as some letters arrived from northern Italy bearing stamps of the Italian Social Republic, while others came from the Allied-controlled South with different postage. Her own family's letter had come from territory that had changed hands multiple times in recent months. Were her parents now living under German occupation? Were they considered collaborators for remaining in the North? These questions gnawed at her during sleepless nights in the barracks. The American guards seemed equally confused about how to treat them. Some maintained strict military distance, viewing them as prisoners of war regardless of political complications. Others had begun to relax their supervision, particularly after the connection forged through Sergeant Caruso's cooking. Private Chen no longer stood rigidly apart during work details, but would sometimes join conversations, asking about Italian culture and sharing stories about his own family's immigrant experience. The lines between captor and captive were blurring in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Captain Morrison received contradictory guidance from his superiors. One directive instructed him to maintain standard POW protocols. Another suggested treating the women as displaced persons rather than enemy prisoners. A third memo indicated that their status would remain under review pending further developments in the Italian theater of war. Morrison, a practical man who preferred clear orders to bureaucratic ambiguity, found himself making daily decisions based on instinct rather than regulation. The women's confusion was compounded by radio broadcasts they were allowed to hear during recreation periods. News from Italy painted a picture of a country tearing itself apart. Italian partisans fought against German occupiers in the north. The legitimate Italian government declared war on Germany, making Italy technically a co-belligerent with the Allies. But Italian soldiers who refused to fight for either side were shot as deserters. Civilians caught between the factions faced impossible choices about loyalty and survival. Lucia listened to these broadcasts with growing despair. The Italy she had known, the country she had believed she was serving when she joined the Auxiliary Corps, had ceased to exist. In its place was something fractured and unrecognizable, a nation at war with itself as much as with external enemies. On the last Sunday of October, Sergeant Caruso approached Captain Morrison with an unusual request. He wanted permission to allow some of the Italian women to help prepare the Sunday meal in the camp kitchen. Morrison's first instinct was to refuse. Allowing prisoners unsupervised access to kitchen equipment, knives, and potentially dangerous implements violated multiple security protocols. But Caruso pressed his case with unexpected passion, arguing that cooking together could serve purposes beyond mere food preparation. "Sir, these women are falling apart," Caruso said bluntly. "Half of them got letters telling them they have nothing to go home to. The other half got no letters at all, which might be worse. They need something to do with their hands, something that reminds them they're still human beings with skills and worth, Let them cook. Let them teach us their recipes. It'll be good for morale, theirs and ours." After considerable deliberation, Morrison agreed, but with strict conditions. Only 6 women would be allowed in the kitchen at once under constant supervision. They would be searched before and after. All implements would be counted before they entered and after they left. And at the first sign of any security concern, the experiment would end immediately. Caruso accepted these terms and approached Lucia, Elena, and Giovanna to ask if they would be interested in participating. The 3 women's faces lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm Morrison had seen from them since their arrival. They recruited 3 others, including Maria Fontana from Rome, Rosa Caputo from Tuscany, and Isabella Greco from Abruzzo. The diversity of regions represented promised an interesting culinary collaboration. Sunday morning arrived, and the 6 Italian women entered the American military kitchen with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. What followed was a transformation of the utilitarian cooking space into something approaching an Italian family kitchen, despite the industrial equipment and military rations. The women assessed the available ingredients with practiced eyes, discussing in rapid Italian what could be accomplished with what they had. Sergeant Caruso had managed to procure fresh tomatoes, garlic, onions, several types of meat, pasta, and a precious bottle of olive oil from a supplier who catered to Italian neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Lucia took charge of the sauce, which the women called gravy in the southern Italian tradition. She started by heating olive oil in a large pot, adding crushed garlic until the kitchen filled with its pungent aroma. Maria worked beside her, browning various meats, beef, pork, and sausages that would cook slowly in the sauce for hours. Elena prepared meatballs, mixing ground meat with eggs, breadcrumbs, soaked in milk, grated cheese, and fresh parsley. Her hands worked with automatic precision, shaping each meatball to uniform size. Rosa and Isabella collaborated on pasta, rolling out dough by hand since the kitchen lacked proper pasta-making equipment. Giovanna moved between stations, assisting wherever needed, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by focused energy. The women worked with a synchronicity that came from shared cultural knowledge, anticipating each other's needs, offering suggestions in Italian that flowed like music through the kitchen. As autumn deepened into early winter, the Sunday cooking sessions became a regular feature of camp life. What had begun as an experimental morale program evolved into something far more significant. The Italian women didn't just prepare meals, they taught. American soldiers who had grown up eating their grandmother's Italian cooking suddenly understood the techniques behind familiar dishes. Others who had never tasted Italian food beyond pizza discovered an entire culinary tradition built on regional pride, seasonal ingredients, and the belief that cooking was an act of love. Private Chen, whose guard duty often coincided with kitchen activities, became an eager student. He watched Lucia transform simple ingredients into complex flavors through nothing more than patience and attention to detail. She taught him that good sauce couldn't be rushed, that the longer it simmered, the more the flavors would marry and deepen. She showed him how to taste and adjust, adding a pinch of sugar here, a bit more salt there, trusting his palate to guide him toward balance. The women shared more than recipes. They shared the stories embedded in food, the cultural significance of dishes that marked important occasions. Elena explained that in Milan, families ate risotto alla Milanese on feast days, the golden saffron rice representing prosperity and celebration. Maria described Roman carbonara, insisting that authentic versions never included cream despite what American restaurants served. Rosa shared Tuscan bread soup, a peasant dish that transformed stale bread, beans, and vegetables into something nourishing and satisfying. These cooking lessons opened conversations about life beyond the war. The women talked about their childhoods, their families' traditions, their dreams before everything had changed. American soldiers shared their own stories, discovering that despite fighting on opposite sides, they shared fundamental values about family, home, and the importance of gathering around a table. Food became a neutral territory where former enemies could meet as simply people who appreciated good cooking and the comfort it provided. Sergeant Caruso noticed that the women who participated in cooking sessions seemed more resilient than those who didn't. They had purpose beyond their assigned work duties, creative expression that reminded them of their identities outside their prisoner status. He advocated for expanding the program, allowing more women to rotate through the kitchen, teaching different regional specialties each week. Captain Morrison, seeing the positive effects, approved the expansion despite continued concerns about security protocols. The ripple effects extended beyond the kitchen. Women who had learned English phrases from Sergeant Chen and others began teaching Italian to interested American soldiers. Informal language exchanges happened during work details, meal times, and recreation periods. Giovanna, emerging slowly from the grief of losing her entire family, found purpose in teaching soldiers basic medical Italian, phrases that might help them communicate with Italian civilians as Allied forces pushed northward through Italy. The camp's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The rigid division between captors and captives softened into something more complex and human. This didn't mean the women forgot they were prisoners or that security measures disappeared. But it meant that within those constraints, relationships formed that transcended the categories of enemy and ally. The Italian women were teaching Americans about their culture while learning about American openness and informality. Both groups discovered that their propaganda-fueled assumptions about each other were far from accurate. December arrived with heavy snowfall that transformed the Pennsylvania camp into a landscape that reminded the Italian women of alpine regions, though none of them found comfort in the resemblance. Christmas approached, and with it came a deepening melancholy among the prisoners. This would be their first Christmas away from home, away from family traditions that had defined the holiday for their entire lives. The women spoke quietly among themselves about Christmases past, about midnight mass in ancient churches, about the Feast of the Seven Fishes on Christmas Eve, about family gatherings that seemed impossibly distant now. Lucia proposed an idea to Sergeant Caruso during one of the Sunday cooking sessions. What if the Italian women prepared a traditional Christmas Eve dinner for the entire camp? La Vigilia, the vigil before Christmas, was one of the most important celebrations in Italian culture. Traditionally, it featured 7 different seafood dishes representing the 7 sacraments, though many families prepared even more. The meal was about abundance, family, and preparation for the sacred day to follow. Caruso brought the proposal to Captain Morrison, who saw both the potential benefits and the logistical nightmares. Where would they get enough seafood to feed over 100 people? How would they manage the security concerns of having prisoners preparing such an elaborate meal? What if something went wrong and the holiday celebration turned into an international incident? But the more he considered it, the more he realized that allowing this celebration might be exactly what everyone needed. Morrison contacted suppliers in Philadelphia, explaining that he needed seafood for a special Christmas program at the POW camp. To his surprise, several Italian-American business owners in the city's Italian market district offered to donate food when they learned Italian women prisoners wanted to prepare a traditional meal. Cod, shrimp, calamari, mussels, clams, anchovies, and even some fresh fish arrived at the camp 3 days before Christmas, packed in ice and accompanied by notes of encouragement written in Italian. The women threw themselves into preparation with an intensity that transformed grief into purpose. They planned a menu that would honor their diverse regional traditions while remaining feasible within camp constraints. There would be bacala, salt cod, prepared in tomato sauce, calamari fritti, fried squid that even more non-Italians found appealing, linguine with clam sauce, both white and red versions, to satisfy different regional preferences, shrimp scampi swimming in garlic, butter, and white wine that Sergeant Caruso had somehow procured, mussels steamed in wine and herbs, a seafood salad with octopus, shrimp, and vegetables. And for the seventh dish, anchovy pizza, thin flatbread topped with preserved fish, a humble dish that many of the women had grown up eating. On Christmas Eve morning, 15 Italian women entered the kitchen at dawn. They worked through the day, their hands moving with practiced precision, their voices rising in Italian Christmas carols as they cooked. American soldiers passing by the mess hall stopped to listen, drawn by the music and the incredible aromas drifting from within. The women sang, Tu scendi dalle stelle, their voices harmonizing with natural ease, the sacred words connecting them to generations of Italians who had sung the same hymn on Christmas Eve. Spring arrived in Pennsylvania with the kind of gentle beauty that made the war feel distant and unreal. Apple trees bloomed pink and white around the camp perimeter. Birds returned from their southern migrations, filling the morning air with song. The Italian women had survived a winter of captivity and uncertainty, and with the warming weather came news from the War Department that would force them to confront their futures in concrete terms rather than abstract possibility. Captain Morrison received official notification in April of 1944 that Italian prisoners would begin repatriation processing. The women would be transported to Italy within the next 3 months, released to displaced persons camps, and from there allowed to return to whatever homes still existed. The announcement should have been cause for celebration, the promise of freedom after months of imprisonment. Instead, it triggered a crisis among the women that Morrison hadn't anticipated. The Italy they would be returning to bore little resemblance to the country they had left. Allied forces were pushing slowly northward, fighting fierce battles against German defenders and Italian fascist holdouts. Cities were in ruins. Infrastructure had collapsed. Food shortages were severe. And perhaps most troubling, Italian society had fractured along lines of collaboration, resistance, and survival that would take generations to heal. Women who had served in auxiliary corps, even in non-combat roles, faced suspicion and hostility from multiple directions. Lucia sat in the barracks with her most recent letter from her mother, reading it for the 10th time. Her mother wrote that Naples was under Allied occupation, food was scarce, and former auxiliary members were being questioned about their activities during the fascist period. Some had been arrested as collaborators, others had disappeared, seeking safety in anonymity. Her mother's letter ended with a question that haunted Lucia. What kind of life will you have here? Will you be safe? Will anyone understand that you were just a girl doing what you thought was right? Elena faced similar concerns. Her family had written that Milan remained partially destroyed, with neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Former fascist supporters were being hunted by partisan groups seeking revenge. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred dangerously. Her brothers were still missing, possibly dead, possibly in hiding. Her parents urged her to stay in America if possible, to build a new life rather than return to chaos and judgment. Giovanna had no family to return to, no home waiting for her. Sicily was under Allied control, but economically devastated. As someone with no remaining family connections, she would be entirely alone, dependent on charity, and vulnerable to exploitation. The prospect of returning to Italy terrified her more than remaining in American captivity. At least here she had found purpose in her medical work, respect from Dr. Walsh, who valued her skills, and a community of fellow prisoners who understood her grief. The women began meeting in small groups to discuss their options, speaking in rapid Italian that expressed their fear and confusion. Some felt duty-bound to return despite the dangers, believing they owed Italy their presence in its darkest hour. Others argued that returning would accomplish nothing, that they would be burdens rather than help. Captain Morrison sat in his office reviewing a directive that would change everything for the Italian women. The War Department had created a special classification for Italian prisoners willing to assist Allied operations. Those who volunteered could remain in the United States as civilian employees, working in various capacities that utilized their language skills and cultural knowledge. After the war ended, they could apply for immigration status rather than mandatory repatriation. The program was unprecedented, offering enemy prisoners the opportunity to effectively defect to America. Morrison understood the political and moral complexity of this offer. It essentially asked these women to choose between their homeland and their safety, between duty to Italy and duty to themselves. It would mean admitting that they couldn't or wouldn't return to face whatever consequences awaited them. For some, it would feel like betrayal. For others, it would feel like salvation. He dreaded presenting this option almost as much as he dreaded not presenting it. He called a general assembly for all Italian prisoners, standing before them with the official directive in his hands. The women sensed the importance of the moment, their faces reflecting anticipation and anxiety. Morrison read the directive slowly, pausing to allow Lucia to translate complex sections into Italian. As the meaning became clear, absolute silence fell over the assembled women. This wasn't just about when they would return to Italy, it was about whether they would return at all. The directive specified that women who volunteered for civilian status would work as translators, cultural liaisons, and support staff for military operations. They would receive modest wages, housing, and eventually the possibility of permanent residency. But accepting this offer meant signing documents acknowledging they were choosing not to return to Italy when repatriation became available. It meant formally separating themselves from their homeland, at least temporarily, possibly permanently. Lucia felt dizzy as she finished translating. The choice being offered was simultaneously a gift and a curse. Stay in America, where she had found unexpected kindness, where her skills were valued, where she felt safe, or return to Italy, where her mother waited, where her father was buried, where her identity as an Italian woman had meaning despite the risks. How could anyone make such a choice? How could she weigh duty against survival, homeland against sanctuary? Elena's mind raced through possibilities. Her family had urged her to stay if she could. They had explicitly written that returning would be dangerous and possibly pointless. But staying meant abandoning them to face Italy's reconstruction alone. It meant admitting that fear was stronger than loyalty. It meant accepting that she had found in enemy captivity something better than what awaited her in freedom at home. Giovanna's choice seemed clearer on the surface. She had no family to return to, no home waiting. But staying in America meant accepting that her Italian identity would exist in exile, that she would become something neither fully Italian nor fully American. It meant building a life on the foundation of everything she had lost. The grief she carried would remain, but at least here she could carry it while doing meaningful work, while being valued for her skills rather than judged for her past. Captain Morrison dismissed the assembly, giving the women time to consider their options. He required no immediate answer. The days following Captain Morrison's announcement were marked by intense private conversations among the women. The barracks filled each evening with hushed debates, conducted in Italian dialects that reflected the diverse regions these women called home. Arguments that had nothing to do with right or wrong, but rather impossible choices between competing loyalties, competing fears, and competing visions of what their futures might hold. Lucia found herself at the center of these discussions, not because she had answers, but because her translation work had made her a natural mediator among the group. Women sought her counsel in quiet corners of the compound, asking what she planned to do, as if her decision might illuminate their own paths. But Lucia remained paralyzed by indecision, her heart pulled equally in opposite directions by forces she couldn't reconcile or dismiss. Elena had decided within 2 days of the announcement she would stay. Her family had given her permission, even encouragement, to choose America. The practical considerations were overwhelming. Italy offered danger and deprivation, while America offered safety and opportunity. She felt guilty about this decision, as if choosing self-preservation was somehow selfish or cowardly, but she also felt relief at having made any decision at all. Giovanna's choice had been equally swift, but for different reasons. She had nothing to return to in Sicily except memories and graves. Staying in America meant she could continue her medical work with Dr. Walsh, who had already written letters supporting her application for nursing certification. She could build a new life on her own terms rather than returning to a country where she would be alone and vulnerable to exploitation or worse. But for every woman who decided quickly, 3 others agonized over the choice. Maria Fontana had received letters from cousins in Rome who needed help rebuilding their family home. They had lost so much and needed every pair of hands. Could she justify staying in comfortable American captivity while her family struggled with basic survival? Rosa Caputo's husband had been killed fighting for Italy before the surrender. Didn't she owe it to his memory to return and honor his sacrifice by helping rebuild the country he died for? Isabella Greco represented perhaps the most agonizing position of all. Her parents were elderly and lived in Abruzzo, a region that had seen heavy fighting. They were alive but frail. Their letters expressed longing to see their daughter again before they died. How could she choose America knowing her parents might not survive to see her if she delayed her return? Yet, how could she return to an uncertain future when America offered stability and safety? The women who chose to return began to separate themselves emotionally from those choosing to stay. It wasn't hostile or deliberate, but rather a natural consequence of diverging paths. Those returning home bonded over shared commitment to Italy despite the risks. Those staying bonded over shared uncertainty about what it meant to become permanent exiles. The community that had formed over months of shared captivity was fracturing along fault lines that no one could prevent or repair. On the evening of June 18, 1944, the Italian women organized what they called their Last Supper together, though the reference to Christ's final meal with his disciples was not lost on anyone. 23 women had chosen repatriation, scheduled to depart in 3 days. 24 had chosen to remain and accept the offer of civilian employment and eventual immigration. The final decision had split the group almost exactly in half, a division that seemed to emphasize how impossible the choice had been. The women requested permission to prepare one final elaborate meal together, combining Italian traditions with American ingredients they had learned to adapt over 9 months of captivity. Captain Morrison granted permission without hesitation, recognizing the importance of this ritual farewell. Sergeant Caruso opened the kitchen to all 47 women, abandoning security protocols for this one evening, trusting that these women had earned his faith in their intentions and character. They cooked together for hours, creating dishes that represented every region of Italy. From Sicily came caponata, sweet and sour eggplant that Giovanna prepared with tears streaming down her face. From Rome came cacio e pepe, the simple pasta with cheese and pepper that Maria insisted must be made properly despite limited ingredients. From Milan came risotto, creamy and rich, that Elena cooked with the precision her northern upbringing demanded. From Naples came Lucia's grandmother's meatballs, prepared exactly as she remembered them, each one shaped with love and grief in equal measure. They set tables in the mess hall with as much ceremony as military supplies allowed. White tablecloths appeared from somewhere, probably donated by local church groups. Candles were lit despite regulations about open flames. The women insisted on sitting together, mixed between those leaving and those staying, rather than allowing the division to separate them physically. American soldiers were invited to join them, and many accepted, understanding they were witnessing something sacred and rare. As plates were passed and wine appeared, courtesy of Sergeant Caruso's mysterious connections, Lucia stood to speak. Her English had become fluent over the months, losing much of its hesitant quality. She raised her glass and addressed both groups of women, switching between Italian and English so everyone could understand. She spoke about arriving in this camp 9 months earlier, frightened and angry, feeling abandoned by Italy and imprisoned by America. She spoke about discovering that enemies could become friends when given the chance to see each other as human beings. She spoke about the spaghetti that had broken through their defenses, about the cooking lessons that had taught them more than recipes, about the Christmas feast that had reminded them who they were beyond their status as prisoners. She acknowledged the pain of the choice that had divided them, the impossible decision between homeland and safety. She insisted that neither choice was right or wrong, only different responses to circumstances beyond anyone's control. June 21, 1944, dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect summer morning that seemed to mock the sadness permeating the camp. The women who had chosen repatriation woke early, packing their few belongings into military-issued duffel bags. They owned almost nothing beyond the clothes they wore and small personal items they had managed to keep through months of captivity. Yet each bag felt impossibly heavy with the weight of what this departure represented. Lucia helped Elena pack, though Elena was staying and didn't need assistance. They simply wanted these final minutes together, two friends who had supported each other through the hardest months of their lives. Elena pressed a small recipe book into Lucia's hands, pages filled with handwritten instructions for Milanese dishes she had taught during kitchen sessions. "So you don't forget Northern Italian cooking," Elena said, attempting lightness that neither of them felt. Lucia hugged her fiercely, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The transport trucks arrived at 9 o'clock. American soldiers who had guarded these women for 9 months now helped them board with a gentleness that acknowledged this wasn't a typical prisoner transfer. These weren't defeated enemies being shipped home in disgrace. These were women making an impossibly brave choice to return to a devastated homeland because they believed they should, despite every reason to stay. Captain Morrison stood at attention as the women formed lines. He had prepared a brief speech but found himself unable to deliver the formal words he had written. Instead, he spoke from his heart, in simple language that needed no translation. "You came here as prisoners, you leave as friends. What you taught us about courage, dignity, and humanity will stay with us forever. We hope Italy treats you better than it has, and that you find the peace you deserve." Maria Fontana, who had chosen to return despite having no specific family obligation, stepped forward to respond for the group. Her English had improved dramatically over the months, and she spoke with quiet dignity. "We came here hating America. We leave loving what America showed us about ourselves. You gave us kindness when you could have given cruelty. You gave us purpose when we felt worthless. You gave us hope when we had none. Whatever happens in Italy, we will remember that Americans are capable of mercy and grace." The women who were staying lined up along the fence as the trucks prepared to depart. They didn't cry, having exhausted their tears over previous days. Instead, they stood in silent witness as their friends, their fellow prisoners, their sisters in this strange shared experience prepared to leave. Giovanna raised her hand in farewell to women she had cooked beside, prayed beside, grieved beside. Elena whispered Italian blessings under her breath. The remaining women stood together in solidarity, watching as the trucks rolled through the gates. The women who remained found themselves in strange new positions. They were no longer prisoners of war, but not yet full civilians. They occupied a liminal space between categories, employed by the military but not soldiers, Italian by birth but no longer resident in Italy, displaced persons seeking to become immigrants in a country that had been their enemy months earlier. The transformation of their status required paperwork, interviews, security clearances, and patience as military bureaucracy ground slowly forward. Elena was assigned to work as a translator at the War Department's processing center in Philadelphia, helping handle the flood of Italian-language documents related to the Allied campaign in Italy. She found lodging with an Italian-American family in South Philadelphia who welcomed her warmly, having heard about the women from the POW camp. The neighborhood reminded her of Milan, filled with the sounds and smells of Italian life transplanted to American soil. Giovanna continued her medical training under Dr. Walsh's supervision, working toward nursing certification while assisting in military hospitals treating wounded soldiers returning from European theaters. Many of these soldiers had been wounded in Italy, and Giovanna found purpose in caring for men who had fought in her homeland. She apologized to them in Italian and English, knowing her apologies couldn't undo their injuries, but needing to express her grief about the war's human cost nonetheless. The other women who stayed scattered across Pennsylvania and nearby states, finding work and housing through a network of church groups, Italian-American organizations, and military connections that Captain Morrison helped establish. Some worked in factories producing war materials. Others found positions as translators, teachers, or domestic workers. Each woman carried forward the skills and lessons learned during their captivity, building new lives from the fragments of their old ones. Lucia secured a position teaching Italian language and culture at a small college in Harrisburg, recommended by Captain Morrison, who had been impressed by her intelligence and teaching ability during their months of interaction. She found a small apartment near campus, furnished with second-hand items donated by faculty members who admired her courage and resilience. She wrote to her mother weekly, sending money when she could, describing her new life in careful detail that emphasized opportunity rather than loss. The women maintained connections with each other through letters and occasional meetings, creating an informal support network of Italian women navigating American life while carrying the weight of their complicated pasts. They celebrated Italian holidays together, cooked traditional meals, spoke their language without shame or apology. They also embraced American customs, learning to celebrate Thanksgiving, attempting to understand baseball, gradually absorbing the rhythms and values of their adopted country while maintaining pride in their Italian heritage. 20 years passed with the kind of speed that only becomes apparent in retrospect. The frightened young woman who had stepped off that transport truck in September of 1943 had become someone quite different by 1964. Lucia Martinelli, now Lucia Henderson, after marrying an American teacher she met at the college, stood in the kitchen of her restaurant in South Philadelphia, stirring a pot of sauce that had been simmering since dawn. The restaurant was called Casa Martinelli, a tribute to her family's lost trattoria in Naples and to the new home she had built in America. The menu featured dishes from across Italy, recipes she had learned from her grandmother, from other women at the camp, from the Italian-American community that had welcomed her. But the signature dish, the one that appeared on every table at some point during the meal, was spaghetti and meatballs made according to Sergeant Frank Caruso's grandmother's recipe. Lucia had perfected it over the years, adding her own touches while respecting the foundation that Nonna Maria had established decades earlier in a different immigrant kitchen. Casa Martinelli had become more than just a restaurant. It was a gathering place for the Italian-American community, a bridge between generations, and a symbol of how food could carry history forward while creating new traditions. Former soldiers who had served in Italy came to eat and remember. Italian immigrants found flavors that reminded them of home. Americans who had never been to Italy discovered what authentic Italian cooking meant beyond pizza and generic red sauce. On this particular evening in October, the restaurant hosted a reunion that had been years in planning. Elena had returned from Italy, where she had been living for the past 5 years, having finally felt safe enough to reclaim her Italian identity. Giovanna, now Dr. Giovanna Costa, had traveled from Boston, where she directed a nursing program at a major hospital. Other women who had chosen to stay in America had gathered from across the country, gray-haired now, but still recognizably the young prisoners who had found unexpected kindness in captivity. Most remarkably, 3 women who had chosen repatriation in 1944 had made the journey from Italy to join them. Maria Fontana had rebuilt her family home in Rome and raised 4 children who were now adults. Rosa Caputo had remarried and lived in Florence, working as a teacher. Isabella Greco had cared for her parents until their deaths and now lived quietly in Abruzzo, content with a simple life in the mountains she had always loved. They gathered around a long table in the private dining room, these women who had shared the most transformative year of their lives 2 decades earlier. Lucia served them the meal that had started everything, spaghetti and meatballs that smelled exactly like home, whichever home each woman chose to claim. They raised their glasses in a toast that required no words, understanding perfectly what they were celebrating. They were honoring impossible choices made in impossible circumstances. They were acknowledging that both groups had been right to choose as they did. They were proving that divided hearts could heal, that friendships forged in captivity could survive decades and oceans, and that food would always possess the power to bridge distances that politics and war created. The sauce had taken hours to prepare, just as healing had taken years. But like Nonna Maria had always said, the best things in life require time, patience, and the understanding that love, whether for food, family, or adopted country, cannot be rushed. It must simmer slowly until all the flavors marry into something richer than any single ingredient could create alone. Casa Martinelli stood as proof that home could exist in multiple places simultaneously, that Italian women could become American without ceasing to be Italian, and that the greatest victory over war's divisions was not forgetting the past, but rather transforming it into nourishment for the present and future.